Hello and good morning, everybody. It is me, Julian. Welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. Today, we're going to be talking about the return of the repressed, a concept that I touched upon in last week's lecture. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the relationship between Lacanian psychoanalysis and philosophy. And finally, I would like to introduce the basic difference between primal or primordial repression, so-called Urverdrängung in Freud, and secondary repression, which can be really helpful in understanding both the concept, the return of the repressed, its relationship to various symptoms, such as for Freud, dreams and jokes and the famed slip of the tongue. And finally, I'd like to talk about how Žižek takes this Freudian Lacanian concept of the return of the repressed and applies it to the critique of ideology. All that and more coming up in the next 30 minutes. But first, hello to everybody joining us live. I see students from Chicago and Romania. Greetings. I'm joining you live from London. It is a beautiful autumnal day. And I'd like to also take a brief moment to thank all of our patrons who allow me to keep hosting these open access lectures every week. If you'd like to support my work, please do consider becoming a patron yourself. As a patron, you can access a weekly bonus seminar where I take your questions live on Discord and answer them, as well as edited transcripts for the lectures, audio downloads for all of my lectures, a weekly masterclass audio, and perhaps most importantly, a recurring ebook subscription service, where at the end of each of these lecture series, each being about 3 months, I release an accompanying ebook. In fact, the next ebook for this lecture series will be on the concept of subjective destitution. And right now you can also download all of my previous ebooks, including the complete guide to Žižek. Okay, let's jump right in. Last week, I talked about the return of the repressed, which is a Freudian concept that Žižek frequently uses. Žižek's example, as it appertains to ideology, is that the most ideological gesture is precisely anyone who claims to be non-ideological. Žižek's basic argument being that non-ideology, the supposed post-ideological turn that corresponds with post-politics, I can explain that concept later, is itself an ideological expression, and one that yields or results in the return of ideology in a more aggressive guise, the return of the repressed. But I'll get to that eventually. Instead, I'd like to begin by giving you some basic definitions, some easy formulas, if you will, that can help you access the idea of repression. Because let's be very clear, repression is one of the most important concepts within Žižek, Lacan, and Freud's body of work. And perhaps the easiest way to begin understanding repression is to learn to differentiate between primordial repression, what Freud calls Urverdrängung, and secondary repression. Now, primordial repression occurs essentially at the very beginning of life, at birth. Primordial repression is what you need in order to function as a living being. For Freud, primordial repression is essentially sexual in nature, and yet that doesn't mean that it is, strictly speaking, about desire. Instead, on a structural level, as soon as you decide that you want to do something that goes above and beyond your desires, you have practiced primordial repression. For example, let's say that you need to go to the bathroom, but you hold it in. Here we have an instance of primordial repression. In other words, the subject itself, your very being, your ego, if you will, is tied to the act of primordial repression. It makes you a person. You're not simply an animal working upon instinct. In fact, any time that you don't act on instinct, but instead have a subjective will, you have a form of primordial repression. However, beyond and above this, there's another more philosophical layer of primordial oppression that occurs, which is to say, it's not simply that you don't do what you want to do so that you might do something else. Instead, to simply be and exist requires itself an a priori primordial repression. For example, let's say that you want to communicate. This one is very important for Lacan, being a structuralist, thereby focusing on language and linguistics. Let's say that you want to communicate an idea. The question is this idea originating in your head as a priori thought, or is it itself already a reaction to something that you've seen? Vice versa, you could say that when you articulate an idea, you are already anticipating the other person's response to it. Therefore, here you already have a repression of sorts. Namely, as soon as you say something, as soon as you articulate something, be it either by means of literary or linguistic gestures, signifiers, or simply by means of the way in which you act, the way in which you dress. As soon as you start being in the world, and thereby being for others, you have always already primordially repressed the supposed intent that lay or belay your actions or your will. This is the Sartrean hell is other people. We are trapped in differentiation with others. There is no solid grounding upon which we truly ever act as a free subject. Every action, every thought is already caught up in interactions with others, ideas about others, etc. So here we also have Urverdrängung. And here it's important to note the Ur in Verdrängung. The word primordial and primal doesn't entirely do it justice, which is to say, Ur essentially is indicating that there is something at a zero-sum level, like not just the basement level, like the starting point, but something even deeper than that. In other words, Freud is essentially implying that to even exist as a person, there has to be a repression that occurs, a kind of big bang of repression that allows you to posit your existence in the first place. And even on a biological level, you could say that this takes place. One of the classic symptoms of neurosis is that you become overly aware of your own bodily functions to the point that you can no longer participate in normal life. For example, you develop an inability to swallow because you focus on the act of swallowing, or you start blinking manically because you had never thought about blinking, which you do automatically, and so you start forcing yourself to blink. Even breathing can be like this. There are so many things that your body does on a kind of autopilot that are therefore primordially repressed. In fact, as we learn more about how the brain functions, we realize that there are so many levels at which we're essentially working on autopilot. There are things happening in our body and in our brains that we don't even notice, that we essentially take for granted. And one of the symptoms of neurosis is that we stop taking them for granted. We become painfully aware of them, and so we hyperfixate on them. Now, I alluded to this before, but I think it's actually quite important. Freud says that in order for repression to occur, repression usually being secondary repression, Urverdrängung, or primary repression, has to occur, which is to say, primary repression is actually a very fruitful foundation upon which the subject stages his existence. Once again, to forego primary repression would result in a deeply neurotic, potentially even psychotic subject who is completely unable to function. In other words, one of the things that's quite important to note is that from a Freudian perspective, repression always has a certain positive connotation, not simply speaking a negative one. Whereas in the popular sense of the term, we often think of repression as negative, like something that you've buried away to the corners of your subconscious, and yet when it emerges, it's suddenly this beast that sort of comes back to bite you. And yet this is precisely not what Freud had in mind. When it comes to the idea of repression, Freud wasn't talking about the subconscious, this a murky place in which you put all of your negative feelings and desires, your drives, your instincts, etc., that would then come out in an explosive orgy of the id. That's not what Freud had in mind. Instead, what Freud had in mind was the unconscious, which is to say, Primal repression, Urverdrängung, creates the subject of the unconscious, a subject whose very existence and participation in social life is predicated upon this primal or primary Urverdrängung, i.e. repression. In other words, once again, repression is actually a constitutive feature of the subject's own agency, of its existence as such. In fact, secondary repression, or normal repression, Verdrängung, wouldn't occur without the fertile soil of this primary repression. Now, what is secondary repression all about? Well, strictly speaking, secondary repression is a little bit more like when you bury something, when you avoid it, when you compartmentalize it, so that you might function on a day-to-day basis. And yet this thing comes back to haunt you. For example, let's say that somebody in your life has passed away, and instead of confronting the grief, you simply pretend like it never happened. Sooner or later, you will be confronted with something that brings this repressed truth back to light, and it will hit you with the full force of the unacknowledged content of your grief. And it's important to note here that repression, which for Freud is secondary repression, i.e. that which occurs after primordial repression, is what leads to symptoms. In other words, symptoms such as a dream, or symptoms for Freud such as a joke. These secondary stages, if you will, of consciousness are where the symptom emerges, where it speaks to, in, and through us. But let me take a step back, because I realize I'm introducing a lot of jargon here. So Freud has this interesting idea where he says that there's basically three ways in which the return of the oppressed occurs. Once again, the return of the oppressed is the return of a symptom which has been repressed. Once again, the most important thing to note here is that the symptom is not, strictly speaking, the exact same object of that which was repressed. So let's say that you have something and you repress it, like a negative thought. It's not that that thought comes out like a jack-in-the-box. That's not the return of the repressed. Instead, for Freud, repression itself leads to the creation of something entirely new, which could only exist by means of said repression. To give you an example that isn't entirely true to Freud, but perhaps easy to understand, let's say that you're feeling pain, that you're sad about something. It's very common that people who feel in pain will lash out in anger. In other words, their pain is repressed, and this in turn leads them to be angry with other people. They have unacknowledged or unresolved pain that leads them to be angry. In fact, often when you see somebody who's being unpleasant to you, it's likely because they're hurting, that there's something that they haven't acknowledged to themselves, and that therefore they're being unpleasant to you. Here you can see the relationship between repression and transference. The repressed content leads to a symptom which is then transferred onto the other subject. In fact, to my mind, when people are angry or upset with each other, often it's because there's an unacknowledged pain lying behind it. However, this isn't really what Freud meant, because if we explain it like this, it sounds almost a little bit too much like contemporary clinical psychology. Instead, what Freud had in mind is that the return of the repressed occurs by means of an entirely new formation. To put it in terms of contemporary AI, it's like a hallucination, when AI creates something that is itself the result of that which it could not express. Likewise, a symptom is the quote-unquote positive or constitutive result, positive not in a normative sense, i.e. not that it is good, but that it is creative by means of the repression itself. In other words, it's not simply that repression buries something underneath the surface, which then returns. It's that the very act of repression itself generates something new, which would not have existed save for the act of repression as such. The example that Freud uses are dreams. He says, when we dream, we are under those conditions in which the unconscious speaks to us, not to reveal some underlying secret or some repressed content, but in the form of the dream itself, we have the expression of repression as such. In other words, what Freud is arguing here is that repression isn't simply the act of burying something. Instead, repression is an active, constitutive gesture by which something is articulated. And this is actually quite important, because the ordinary way in which a lot of people think about repression is that it is simply compartmentalization. You don't confront something unpleasant, and yet eventually it will come back to bite you. Like, if I don't go to the dentist for long enough, then I will have tooth pain. And yet, this is not really what Freud means by repression. It's not simply something which returns to haunt you. It is something that, through its very repression, creates the mechanism for something new. Let me give you an example. Here you can see the influence of the idea of Freudian repression upon the thinking of Marx. In fact, many contemporary Marxists draw upon psychoanalysis for this exact reason, which is to say, the very theory of revolution isn't simply about the oppressed working class coming back to take it out on their masters, but instead it is the very fact of the necessary repression of the working class and the alienation that ensues through and with it, that thereby brings about what Marx would have called historical materialism, the unfolding of a deterministic economic movement similar to that of Hegelian spirit, an unfolding of a manifestly new set of contradictions that thereby creates the new, namely contradiction and clash, in this case, revolution, the contradiction between classes. In other words, it's not simply that the working class is repressed and they will come back and realize that there are more of them than their masters and essentially enact revenge. It's that the process by which the working class remains exploited creates the unique historical constellation through which crisis becomes inevitable. This is also why Marx frequently argued that it was not the goal of a revolution to emancipate the working class, i.e. to make them wealthier or have more leisure time or more rights within capitalism, but that it was the realization that the working class was not a natural class. In other words, the elimination of capital would eliminate the necessity for the working class as such. Hence why the goal of the working class was to be emancipated from itself, which is to say, in a revolution, the working class would cease to exist. But the very power relations between a working class and an elitist class would itself also fade away. Hence, once again, it's not about the working class rising up to enact revenge upon the elites, but instead the very system of exploitation by which elites and the working class exist would crumble and fade away. What I'm trying to point out here is that we have two different conceptions of repression. We have the clinical, if you will, idea of repression, in which something is simply compartmentalized or buried away, which then comes back to haunt you, versus the Freudian idea of repression, which is actually a constitutive feature. It is something which has a language, as it were, which speaks, which creates novel constellations. Now, I realize I'm introducing a lot of things here, perhaps that haven't been fully fleshed out. Maybe the next lecture series should be called The Return of the Repressed. Like, we could easily do 12 weeks on this. But I would like to briefly talk about the relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy and how it relates to the idea of the return of the repressed. And then conclude by talking about how Žižek applies Lacanian psychoanalysis in relationship to the idea of repression to adapt it to the critique of ideology. So let's begin with psychoanalysis versus philosophy. Lacan is an anti-philosopher. This is actually quite important to understand. And yet it might appear to be counterintuitive. After all, Lacanian psychoanalysis has become very prominent within a certain subset of what you might call continental philosophy and theory, the kind which we practice on this channel. And so this creates the question, what is Lacan's relationship apropos philosophy? After all, Lacan deals with philosophy over and over again. Arguably, he talks about the Cartesian cogito, he talks about Marxist surplus value in relationship to surplus enjoyment, and when it comes to transference, he talks a lot about Plato. In fact, he even speaks about Hegel. Although, side note, Žižek, in The Most Sublime Hysteric, which is technically his first book, says that his attitude is to completely ignore any overt references from Lacan apropos Hegel, and instead to read Lacan as a Hegelian and vice versa, Hegel through the lens of Lacan. Side note. So why is it that Lacan is an anti-philosopher and yet nevertheless draws upon philosophy? Well, there's two ways to answer that. One is that after Hegel, the so-called post-metaphysical turn, philosophy in its traditional idealist, transcendental sense ceases to exist, or at least ceases to plausibly exist. The introduction of the Kantian critical framework, the critique of pure reason, created an opening by which Hegel could essentially posit a, if you will, dialectical transcendentalism, which nevertheless made the idea of a binary transcendentalism a la Plato impossible. Namely, we no longer have ideal pure form essence versus lowly phenomenal appearance, the classic division of traditional metaphysics. Instead, we have the Hegelian dialectical metaphysics, in which we have essence as appearance, and vice versa. This means that any traditional metaphysics after the post-metaphysical Hegelian turn must strike us as hopelessly naive. This leads us then to the innovation, if you will, of more contemporary post-metaphysical thinkers, such as, for example, Heidegger, but then we also find it in various structuralist approaches, including the work of Lacan, and then the post-structuralist work of Michel Foucault, etc. Marxism itself is deeply anti-metaphysical in that it is, strictly speaking, an anti-philosophy. Historical materialism is not simply the bringing down to earth of Hegelian dialectics, but rather the application of the idea of the dialectic to forces in the world. In other words, after Hegel, there's a turn away from traditional idealism, which at that point becomes characterized as naive, towards what you might call a post-metaphysical stance that radically includes and counts in the subjects and the world of phenomenal appearances. In fact, grants them priority above the idea of any a priori idealized essence or conception of the absolute. Once again, the Hegelian post-metaphysical system is essentially a system by which the absolute is de-idealized and made phenomenally relevant. So, once again, to return to the question of Lacan versus philosophy. Lacan, as a structuralist, is therefore already inclined to be anti-philosophical. The inquiry that Lacan is interested in is the emergence of the subject, specifically the subject of the unconscious. Namely, the unconscious, which, remember, is both predicated on primordial repression, the fertile soil upon which secondary repression can occur. For Lacan, this repression is expressed through language. Namely, language is the ultimate differentiator. When we speak, we communicate our ideas to others, and yet these ideas are always already structured by the internal division of miscommunication. And the Lacanian argument, to simplify it to the extreme, is that not only is language structured by this antagonism, but the subject is structured, indeed overdetermined, by this very antagonism as well. Moreover, the subject is nothing more and nothing less than this antagonism. Moreover, the ultimate repression is in fact the repression of this antagonism. Once again, the fundamental fantasy, the Lacanian term, the fundamental fantasy is precisely that the subject is not split from within a priori. Hence, the Lacanian structuralist position, apropos subjectivity, is that the very repression of its internal antagonism is constitutive to the subject. Essentially, Lacan universalizes repression. It is no longer simply a sexual feature in which the subject is split between his desires and his actions, but instead the subject is only repression, is only the repression of repression as such. Now, to answer the second part of the question, philosophy versus psychoanalysis. If, from a Lacanian perspective, the subject is a priori primally split, and this is a constitutive tension through which the subject emerges as a supposed self-identical, self-reflected, i.e. non-split entity, then this also tells us something about philosophy. If we take the Lacanian structuralist framework and we apply it to the pre-metaphysical split, the world before Kant and Hegel, and the post-metaphysical split, we can see a similar structure emerge. The Platonic metaphysical universe is supposedly that which is divided between essence and appearance. And yet from a Hegelian perspective, which therefore reveals itself as quite Kantian, this division itself can only emerge because of a primal repression that creates the horizon against which this division can occur. Namely, as Kant already pointed out in the Critique of Pure Reason, the very idea of essence is itself a phenomenal appearance, i.e. it emerges as a concept through subjective reason. Therefore, subjective reason could never be a priori, inasmuch as essence could not be a priori, lest conceptually essence was upheld as an a priori that could never be thought, the Kantian thing in itself. However, where Lacan famously links Kant avec Sade is that this dimension of impossibility is itself what structures the subject. It is through this impossibility that subjective reason can access enjoyment, being in the world, being an agent of will, essentially. Hence, the post-metaphysical turn, the Hegelian insight, is for Lacan already buried within the history of metaphysics going all the way back to Plato as such. And now we can conclude by returning to Žižek. Žižek's argument, his Lacanian reading of Hegel, essentially lays this out and radicalizes it. Žižek takes the Lacanian structuralist idea of the subject, a subject who represses his own repression, as it were, a subject who is constitutively split, a subject, if you will, of pure difference, and applies this to the ontology of the Hegelian dialectic. Namely, he takes the Lacanian structuralist position and turns it into an ontic inquiry. If you're wondering what an ontic inquiry is, it is an inquiry into the nature of being. And Žižek's answer, to put it somewhat simply, is that everything is always already constitutively split. In other words, even essence had to be in advance split from within. And Žižek articulates that the Hegelian dialectic therefore offers the only properly philosophical dimension as to the expression of Lacanian psychoanalysis, but vice versa, that without Lacanian psychoanalysis, philosophy loses its properly ontic dimension. In other words, Žižek is basically saying that we need psychoanalysis to save philosophy from itself, and in so doing, revitalize philosophy. Now, what does it mean to revitalize philosophy? Well, for Žižek, the answer is clear. If Marx is the continuation of Hegel by other means, then the supposed post-Marxist turn, the emergence of a post-ideological world in which ideology is made manifest by supposed non-ideology, then in this contemporary situation that we find ourselves in, what Adorno would have called a historical constellation, The only way forward is by means of going back to Hegel and Lacan and reconsidering the Marxist questions of historical materialism by means of focusing on dialectical materialism. To put that in a simpler formula, Žižek radically rejects post-structuralism, postmodernism, cultural studies, even certain aspects of post-colonial theory and contemporary feminism, and instead suggests a move back to the central questions of historical and dialectical materialism framed through the Hegelian Lacanian lens. That is Žižek's argument. In other words, in order to fully understand Žižek's position, it's really helpful to understand what primal repression is and secondary repression is. The constitutive subject, the subject who is split from within, the subject of the unconscious, the subject of repression, is therefore both the symbol, the metaphor, and the key, if you will, for unlocking the future of philosophy. Žižek's basic wager, therefore, is that it is only by means of psychoanalysis that we can properly understand the most important element of the Hegelian post-metaphysical turn, and then use this to revitalize Marxism, historical materialism, and dialectical materialism so as to undo the failed, if you will, dead end of post-structuralist, postmodern philosophy. That is Žižek's argument and wager. And I know that's a lot to introduce here, so perhaps we should do the next lecture series on the concept of the return of the repressed. But that's the basic gist of it. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. Thank you for helping me create the space where we can talk about philosophy and theory in this very direct manner. If you'd like to join my seminar where I answer student questions, I'm going to be recording that in like 2 minutes or so, live on Discord. You can also download the seminars on my Patreon. But above all, thank you for being here with me today. And if you like my work and if you'd like to support my work, please do consider becoming a patron. It means the world to me. Thank you so much. I will see you next week.